Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Gary Levinson. I am the Artistic Director of the Chamber Music Society of Fort Worth, and after really what seems like a lifetime, although it's only been but almost 2 years, I am thrilled to welcome you to our pre-concert talk. I cannot really express how emotional it is to see people in the house, and it's great to welcome back, actually, Laurie Shulman, who is our intrepid annotator and my partner in crime. So please give her a warm welcome. We are on.
We are on. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I cannot tell you how special it is to me to be here in this beautiful auditorium, in this beautiful building again, with wonderful musicians, and even if I can only see half your faces, you're real live human beings. When I walked in here this afternoon, I noticed that the bottom line still said via Zoom, and I asked our wonderful tech, John Knuckles, up in the back area there, if he would remove them, and I feel like just not being on Zoom is so extra special. But that stated, we are all aware that today is a very solemn day for everyone in this country and truly around the world. And while we are not ignoring that fact, the overriding message of this afternoon's program is one of hope and optimism and recovery and all things positive.
Absolutely, and I will speak actually after this about what it means to all of us to play on September 11th. But I think this program, which you should know, was planned well over 2 years ago, is a special program of incredible positive music, and also music that was, I think at the time, maybe unduly or unjustly neglected. So it's really a great pleasure for us to present this wonderful program of Korngold and Frank Martin.
Yes, it's kind of a Frank Martin sandwich on Korngold bread, if you will. But two really remarkable compositions by Erich Wolfgang Korngold, each of which has a great story behind it. If you know anything about this composer, it is probably because you like Turner Classic Movies or the other classics from the 30s and 40s. These were the films that made a star out of Errol Flynn, and they also won Korngold, his first Academy Award, for Anthony Adverse. He went on to win, I think it was 2 more, The Adventures of Robin Hood, a very early version and still a wonderful classic with the incomparable Olivia de Havilland as his lady love Maid Marian. He also was a swashbuckler who did fake fencing and made the ladies swoon. And Korngold was the guy behind, you remember this early Ronald Reagan film? How about that? That's what America knew Korngold for. And when Jascha Heifetz asked him to write a violin concerto, the reviewers panned it because he'd quoted from some of his inimitable movie themes, which were just spectacularly beautiful and very well orchestrated. And they very famously denounced the concerto as more corn than gold. So we are here today to rehabilitate Erich Wolfgang Korngold, who was hailed by wonderful composers in Vienna. He was born in 1897. He grew up in a Vienna of Mahler and Richard Strauss. And Mahler spoke very highly of the young Erich Wolfgang Korngold, thought he was a huge talent. By the time he was 16, his orchestral works had already been performed by the major orchestras. Richard Strauss, another composer-conductor, who was awed by the talent that Korngold had.
We should also say that the repertoire that I would say is standard rep for chamber music of Korngold's happens to be when he was 16, 17 years old. So the piece we're about to hear, we'll speak about Much Ado, but the piano trio and the piano quintet are absolute standard rep for everything that we do, and yet, unjustly so, his great scores are orchestral, and his chamber music scores happen to be quite early in the time that he was studying with Mahler.
So what we're going to be opening with is 4 pieces for violin and piano that are actually arrangements Korngold made of a set of incidental music for a production of Shakespeare's Much Ado About Nothing. Now, for those of you who don't remember too much about this particular Shakespeare play, it is one of the comedies, and it is a play about mixed up identity, love, and deception. So there are 2 couples involved in it. And the important ones are Beatrice and Benedict, whom some of you might remember from, I think it was Kenneth Branagh and Emma Thompson, who did a remake in the late 90s. Yeah. So what we are going to do, and I just sprung this on Gary about 5 minutes ago.
We're going to do an expressive reading that is unrehearsed.
I think it's from the first act when these two start throwing sparks off each other. I had rather hear my dog bark at a crow than a man swear he loves me.
God keep your ladyship still in that mind, so some gentleman or other shall scape the predestinate scratched face.
Scratching could not make it worse, and 'twere such a face as yours were.
Well, you are a rare parrot teacher.
A bird of my tongue is better than a beast of yours.
I would my horse be speed of your tongue, and so good a continuer.
But keep your way, O God's name, I have done. Okay, that's the end of our dramatic reading, just to give you the flavor. So with that, I'd like to move to the music. It opens with a suite called Bridal Morning. It is obviously not Beatrice and Benedict's Bridal Morning. It's Heroes. She's the other female lead in the play. And she's experiencing a lot of uncertainty, which you will hear in the way Korngold kind of jumps around and lets you know she's a little skittish about this marital experience that's about to happen. John, may we hear example 1, please? What I hear in this is that she's very excited about the prospect, but gosh, I really don't know what I'm getting into. And then her moods are sort of on a bit of a roller coaster.
Absolutely, and you hear the musical language of Korngold, and this is why I keep going back to the fact that he was a much more serious composer than the public really knew, even from the start, because in Vienna, he was just the kid. And then in Hollywood, he was the voice of Hollywood. But here, you hear how incredibly skillful he is with the violin arrangement and the piano. Originally, this was an orchestral piece.
That is true.
The language is incredibly skillful to be able to take something that is designed for a large group and to make it this dramatic for the small group is really quite something.
Every Shakespeare play, even the tragedies, includes a comic relief episode. In a comedy, the comic relief is even more comedic. In this case, it's 2 night watchmen named Dogberry and Verges. And they have been drinking on the job is the only way to phrase it politely. Gary mentioned to me when we were speaking a couple of weeks ago in preparation for today that he thought that Korngold, of all the Viennese composers of his era, was the one who maintained a sense of humor. And you really hear that in the way Dogberry and Verges, they're marching, but they're stumbling, it's irregular, and you can tell they are tipsy as all get out. Clip 2, please, John. These violin piano arrangements that Korngold made found their way into the repertoire of 2 of the most famous violinists of the first half of the 20th century, Jascha Heifetz and Fritz Kreisler. So they got a lot of play, and Korngold's music became more widely known. In the intermezzo, the 3rd movement that we hear, this is Beatrice. She is questioning herself as she starts to realize that she's not only intellectually sparring with this Benedict, but that she actually kind of likes him a lot. So we have hints of untapped passion as she grows she starts to come to grips with her growing love for Benedict. Number 3, please. And in the finale, which is a masquerade and also it's a dance called the hornpipe, which was popular in the British Isles in Shakespeare's day, both couples have been reunited. Hero has been cleared of the false claims of infidelity to her fiancé. They're getting back together. Benedict proposes to Beatrice. She says yes, and everybody dances and has a wonderful time at the end. To me, this sounds so much like Percy Granger. It's just fabulous. Number 4, please. We move now to the central work on this afternoon's program, a piano quintet by the Swiss composer Frank Martin, who is relatively little known on this side of the Atlantic, but he's like the Jean Sibelius of Switzerland. And Gary reminded me that one of the reasons his music doesn't get wide play is that he wrote marvelously for woodwind instruments, particularly flute. And people have sort of sidelined him as a one-work or one-instrument composer and not given him full credit for the diversity of music that he composed.
Which is, of course, unfair to his legacy, but I should also add that he was a really wonderful pianist who made a major mistake of living in the academia. And that's a mistake only for your career performances, because unlike now, if you're a dean of music and you can get your stuff performed because you're a dean of music, in his time they were saying, well, we don't really want this guy's music played because, he's only teaching. So it's somehow in their eyes a compromise. So a lot of his music actually is incredibly skillfully written. I think you'll agree that this quintet is really beautiful and has incredible neo-Baroque gestures, which is very unusual for the time that it was written, because if you don't look at the program notes, and you have to look at the program notes, but if you didn't, you might swear, hey, some of this stuff was written in the 1800s or even in the Baroque.
Indeed.
It is just an incredible way of composing.
Yeah. And as I have pointed out in the notes, although Martin eventually turned to 12-tone music, he wrote this quintet 10 years before he was even dabbling in that. And it's essentially in D minor or F major with some chromaticism for most of it. Because this is probably the first time most of you have ever heard any music by him, I've made a generous handful of audio clips. We're going to start with the opening chorale, which features just pulsating strings. It's tense and anguished and relentless. Track 5, please. Even though it's in triple time, it almost sounds like a funeral march. It's very anguished.
Yeah, for me, to me, it has a lot of flavor of Villa Lobos. It's a very, we'll get to it in a minute, but there is a lot of folk melodies here, and it seems to sound like it comes from South America, except he was Swiss. And as my music director, as Louise likes to say, the Swiss are sometimes incredibly boring, but most often privately passionate. So this is, I think, is the latter.
Okay. When the piano finally enters, it's in kind of a slow motor rhythm, and the strings turn to pizzicato. I hear this as very Bach-like, almost unfolding as a free fantasia. Mm-hmm. May we hear track 6, please? next example, we're still in the first movement. We hear how he superimposes these two ideas, that pulsating string chorale and the more flowing piano thing as he builds to an early climax in the movement. This is track 7, please, with the two ideas superimposed. Martin's second movement is a minuetto, which has a lot of scherzo flavor to it, but his title of minuetto is another bow to the late 18th century.
Absolutely, and I should just mention that one of the most famous minuets is in the Saint-Saëns cello concerto, which is much later. So the French and I would say the Swiss and Belgians made generous use of the Baroque dances without them being actually Baroque dances. It's more of a gesture of the dance and the flavor of 20th century, really.
Let's listen to track 8, and then I have a couple of observations about it. It's playful, it leaves you hanging in suspense, you don't quite know which direction it's going. I think of this as what I call tadpole music, where it's sort of switching directions and going off on the surface of the water very rapidly.
Indeed, and for me, it straddles that line, kind of like Leonard Bernstein's music, that it was very on the popular side and yet classically based. So for me, it was very interesting that the man made his living as an academic dean, of music and everything else, but when he composed, it was actually firmly in the creative norm.
Gary mentioned that he heard hints of Villa-Lobos in the first movement. I hear this as very French.
Which actually Villa-Lobos is very, very French in many ways.
Because he studied in Paris as well,
right.
yes. Yeah. All right, moving on to the Adagio. This is much darker music. It's clearly the emotional heart of the whole piece. It opens with pulsing piano and uncertain string triplets, and it's very chromatic. Let's listen to track 9, please. It doesn't seem to want to resolve. It's moving forward, and you get that sense of a heartbeat again, but we don't know where it's going to land.
Well, it's interesting. The compositional term is pedal point. So it's the heartbeat is the pedal point, but it's so slow that it's almost interminably slow. But the whole point is he's building up suspense with that slow pedal point.
And he gives us some emotional relief in the middle of the movement with a section that moves to E major. This is just luscious writing for strings. It's very tender, it's very emotional. Track 10, please.
I'd like you to listen to the second violin in this section because she's the one that has the big second violin solo. The melody is actually on the inside of the group, and that is very unusual, and it's very difficult to skillfully compose that.
It's actually the texture of a standard barbershop quartet, where what we would call the second tenor is actually known as the lead in barbershop writing. Yeah. Okay, so moving to the last movement, Gary mentioned earlier that there's a lot of things that draw on folk heritage. Martin actually incorporates a Swiss folk song into this. It's from the Savoy region, Savoie in French. That's from western Switzerland and also borders. There's the Savoy region in southeastern France as well. And this is, I've clipped just where he introduces the popular song, but it's clearly marked there in the score and everything. Track 11, please. are now going to move back to Korngold for this remarkable suite for piano, left hand, and strings. And this requires us to introduce you to an Austrian pianist named Paul Wittgenstein. And if the name sounds familiar, his younger brother was the philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein. Very talented family, very intellectual family. Paul lost his right arm fighting in World War I. He was a highly successful, gifted pianist, and he was determined to continue with his career after the Great War was over.
So we should just mention that besides this incredible suite, which I know you'll enjoy, he commissioned people like Ravel and Prokofiev. For the Ravel, of course, the wonderful left-hand concerto, but Prokofiev also wrote the sonata. So and there are other people who wrote for him, such as Scriabin. And he arguably is more famous now for the works that he commissioned than for his actual playing, because I'll challenge you to find recordings of this guy. They're very hard to find.
So Wittgenstein had already commissioned a piano concerto from Korngold, and he was so delighted with it that he came back to Korngold and asked him for a chamber music piece, which is how we wound up with this suite. For piano, left hand, and strings, and the strings themselves are unusual.
Very unusual. So there is no viola here. There's 2 violins, cello, and piano left hand, obviously. And in many ways, I'm going to be playing second violin on this, and we were discussing during rehearsal, it is a very interesting way of orchestrating it. Now, Wittgenstein, I'm sure when he did the commission, he could care less whether it was 5 people in the strings or 4 or 15. But the point was that I think the second violin, that inner voice, plays some of the viola writing that would have been written if it was a straight string quartet with piano. And also, because of the way that the piano can only play so high with the left hand, the strings, take over some of the soprano writing.
The piece opens with an almost 2-minute cadenza for piano left hand, and I want to play you an excerpt from that so that you can get the sense that the piano is front and center, first among equals. Absolutely. Pretty much throughout this piece. It is rhapsodic, very free, but it's also muscular writing, showing that all that power is there, and it is all over the keyboard. Track 12, please, from the first movement. It's a little thorny, but it definitely gets your attention.
The first time I looked at the piano part, I couldn't believe this is for one hand. I mean, just visually, it looks like 2 hands. You wouldn't even ask. But he writes it so skillfully, and all the inner voices actually do work. But it's a huge workout for our pianist.
If you glance at your program, you'll see that this first movement is a prelude and fugue, another harking back to the Baroque era. Our next example is from the fugue, which is... It's an austere fugue, but to my ears, it sounds like a cross between Bach in the strict counterpoint and the way Shostakovich would write a fugue because of the spare writing a lot in octaves, but it just grows and grows. This entire movement takes 9 or 10 minutes in performance. Let's listen to the segment from the fugue part, track 13, please. It almost unfolds as sequential variations, and the shape of the fugue subject is very like the BACH
Exactly.
Motive that Bach used in a number of significant works. The second movement is a waltz that is straight out of Kreisler's Vienna, and it really sounds like it could have been written by Kreisler for one of the cafes there. Think strolling violinist. Number 14, please. The third movement is a scherzo. This is laid out as a suite, not a multi-movement sonata form, but it's very much, again, echoes of the Baroque era with a little bit of a 20th century accent.
Well, and also a lot of pay homage to Mahler, his teacher. I mean, a lot of this you'll find is straight out of the symphonies, and a lot of, there's a movement here that's called grotesque. We'll get to it in a moment.
I'm not sure I actually have.
We don't have it.
I'm not sure I have a clip from the grotesque.
But my point is that in this 45-minute work, there's a lot of stuff that is a direct homage to his teacher Mahler, and beautifully so.
Let's listen to track 15, which is from the scherzo, and you'll hear unstable rhythms. It's lopsided. It's kind of lurching back and forth. He keeps you guessing about where the downbeat's going to be.
Oh, yeah. So this is the grotesque movement, and interestingly enough, when you think about scherzo, which of course means joke, this is about as far away from jokes as you can guess. However, I think this D major section, which is all Robin Hood, straight Robin Hood. By the way, I know you will find a lot of John Williams scores in this piece, but it came first.
This guy came first, way before John Williams.
All of the current composers were inspired by this guy, and even if they didn't want to admit it. But yeah, the grotesque part of this, he just really straddles the line between playing something that is not supposed to be beautiful or funny, and then all of a sudden you find yourself in Robin Hood.
And you surely heard that it is racing along at breakneck pace. It requires incredible precision among the four players, and it's almost, but not quite, out of control, but somehow he keeps it just within the bounds of...
Compositionally, it's incredible writing. I mean, I keep emphasizing that if Erich Korngold did not write a single film score, he still would have been one of the most successful and well-schooled, as well as brilliant composers of our time.
But I still have a soft spot for Errol Flynn, who never would have been Errol Flynn if it hadn't been for the Korngold music. Okay. Moving on to the fourth movement, it is a Lied, which is, of course, the German word for song, so we're getting sort of the romance aspect in here. It functions as a slow movement within the suite. Let's listen to track 16, please. We do have one final excerpt from the finale, which actually refers to the Lied, sort of makes it a cyclic movement. I particularly wanted you to hear this because we get a sense of what a jolly nature that Korngold had, and we're reminded once again of Gary's observation that he was one of the few Viennese who actually retained a sense of humor.
I have to tell you the Heifetz story, if I may.
Oh, yeah.
So Jascha Heifetz was not a fan of music of his time, unlike myself, who is a huge fan and commissioned a lot of stuff. So finally, he decided that Korngold was going to be the one to write him a violin concerto. And Korngold did everything he wanted to. He received the first movement on time. Heifetz plays it. Wonderful. Second movement, gorgeous. Third movement comes. Heifetz receives it, looks at the score. 5 minutes later, calls Korngold. Korngold answers, and he says, "This is Mr. Heifetz," yes. And he says, "You know, the first two movements were wonderful, but in bar 63, there's this passage, and it is unplayable." So Korngold, without missing a beat, said, "You're Heifetz, aren't you?" and hung up. That's a Viennese guy with a sense of humor.
Okay, let's listen to track 17, which is a clip from the final movement of the suite, Opus 23. To me, this is Mendelssohnian sparkle almost a century later. It's got a lot of Saint-Saëns flashiness and pizzazz to it. It's just brilliant writing.
And a lot of changes of meter. Saint-Saëns would never have made this many changes of meter. He would have thought it's just too unstable. And this guy, with incredible compositional skill, is able to change the meter practically in every bar and still keep it together so you can follow it.
With that, we're going to give you about a 12, 14-minute break before the music starts, but we hope that every last one of you is going to emerge from this afternoon's concert with a newfound enthusiasm for Erich, Wolfgang Korngold, and Frank Martin. Enjoy the music, and thank you so much for being here, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you so much.